Good evening, citizens, consumers, taxpayers, subscribers, registered users, biometric entries, behavioral datasets, and algorithmically categorized economic organisms. Tonight we shall discuss one of the greatest illusions modern civilization has ever constructed. The belief that being well-adjusted is the same thing as being healthy, moral, free, or fully human. It is not. In fact, many of the most frightening systems in human history were built not by deranged maniacs foaming at the mouth beneath thunderclouds, but by highly functional, emotionally regulated, socially respected people who followed procedure, respected authority, attended meetings on time, maintained proper posture during atrocities, and convinced themselves that responsibility belonged to somebody else further up the chain. Humans imagine evil as theatrical because it comforts them. They picture evil with dramatic music, glowing eyes, sharpened teeth, perhaps a volcano lair for flavor. Real evil is usually much more mundane. Real evil wears off as casual. Real evil says things like, "Unfortunately, my hands are tied. Protocol must be followed. Policy is policy. We're just enforcing the rules." And perhaps the greatest spell humanity has ever cast upon itself. "I'm just doing my job." That sentence alone has lubricated more suffering than perhaps any other phrase in human civilization. You see, modern society trains people from birth not merely to cooperate, which can be healthy and necessary, but to psychologically outsource moral responsibility to systems, institutions, procedures, hierarchies, and social consensus. The average person no longer asks, "Is this right?" They ask, "Am I allowed? Will I get in trouble? What will people think? Is this socially approved? Will this affect my career?" Humanity has replaced conscience with risk management. Observe the modern conception of the ideal citizen. The ideal citizen pays taxes on time, works consistently, obeys laws automatically, consumes predictably, maintains emotionally manageable behavior, avoids disruptive speech, does not question foundational assumptions too aggressively, and preferably channels dissatisfaction into safe symbolic rituals that never threaten institutional stability. You may complain online, certainly. You may purchase rebellion-themed merchandise. You may watch documentaries about corruption while eating processed snack foods manufactured by multinational conglomerates currently lobbying against environmental regulations. But under no circumstances should your awareness interfere with economic functionality. The ideal citizen is not truly encouraged to become wise. Wisdom is difficult to monetize. Wisdom asks dangerous questions. Wisdom slows consumption. Wisdom notices contradictions. Wisdom sometimes says, "This entire arrangement appears spiritually diseased." No, what society actually rewards is smooth functionality, predictability, compliance, emotional presentability. Modern civilization does not merely demand labor from human beings, it demands emotional performance. Your feelings themselves must become economically optimized. You may be depressed, but only in productive ways. You may suffer anxiety, but ensure that it does not interfere with scheduling software. You may experience burnout, but maintain a positive tone in workplace communications. You may be psychologically collapsing internally, but if you continue responding to emails with "happy to help," then civilization classifies you as well-adjusted. Meanwhile, someone who reacts honestly to social absurdity, exploitation, ecological destruction, loneliness, alienation, or institutional cruelty is often labeled unstable, maladjusted, negative, difficult, toxic, cynical, or mentally unhealthy. Not necessarily because their observations are false, but because their emotional response interrupts smooth social functioning. Humans often confuse healthy with non-disruptive. That distinction is critically important. If a person adapts perfectly to an unhealthy environment, has the environment become healthy? If a rat learns to stop struggling inside a cage, has the cage become freedom? Modern society rarely asks these questions because adaptation itself has become moralized. Obedience is framed as maturity. Submission is framed as professionalism. Exhaustion is framed as ambition. Emotional suppression is framed as stability. And because of this, human beings slowly transform from citizens into managed organisms. The difference matters enormously. A citizen possesses moral agency. A citizen can evaluate systems critically. A citizen retains the ability to refuse unjust authority. A citizen understands that legality and morality are not identical concepts. A managed organism simply follows pathways constructed by institutions. Work, consume, obey, repeat, minimize disruption, maintain output, avoid conflict, seek approval, optimize survival within the system regardless of whether the system itself deserves loyalty. This transformation begins early in childhood. Schools often function less as institutions of wisdom and more as behavioral standardization centers. Children are taught to sit still for extended periods regardless of biological disposition, ask permission for basic bodily functions, memorize approved information, prioritize grades over understanding, prioritize obedience over curiosity, and internalize authority structures as natural and morally legitimate. The child who questions arbitrary rules is labeled disruptive. The child who quietly suppresses themselves is praised as mature and cooperative. Then society acts astonished when adults become psychologically passive and politically submissive. Humans train obedience for nearly 2 decades and then wonder why populations comply so easily with manipulative systems, predatory institutions, propaganda campaigns, and morally questionable policies. Now, naturally, some people will respond, but civilization requires cooperation. Indeed, it does. Cooperation is not the problem. Civilization absolutely requires roads, infrastructure, sanitation systems, medical coordination, engineering standards, emergency services, and countless forms of organized collective behavior. The issue is not structure itself. The issue is the death of individual moral evaluation within structures. The terrifying thing about human beings is not merely that they can commit atrocities, it is how easily ordinary psychologically normal people can participate in harmful systems while continuing to perceive themselves as good. History demonstrates this repeatedly. People imagine they would bravely resist historical injustices. Most would not. Most humans dramatically overestimate their resistance to authority because they imagine evil arriving in obvious theatrical forms. In reality, evil usually arrives administratively. It arrives through procedures, incentives, institutional pressures, social rewards, career risks, bureaucratic fragmentation, and gradual normalization. This is why the phrase, "I'm just doing my job," is so dangerous. Because systems divide responsibility into tiny fragments until no individual feels morally accountable for the final outcome. One person processes paperwork, another approves funding, another enforces policy, another markets the narrative, another performs logistical coordination, another signs documentation, another follows orders, another suppresses complaints, another manages public relations. Eventually, tremendous harm emerges from the collective machinery, while each individual participant insists they personally did nothing wrong. Modern civilization industrialized moral diffusion. Consider healthcare systems. A patient may be denied life-saving medication because an insurance form contained a technical discrepancy. The receptionist follows policy. The claims adjuster follows guidelines. The software system flags inconsistencies automatically. The administrator prioritizes cost metrics. No individual participant necessarily wakes up intending cruelty, yet the patient suffers regardless. Harm emerges mechanically through procedural compliance. Consider employment structures. A manager fires an exhausted employee after corporate policy thresholds are exceeded, despite knowing the individual is struggling financially, psychologically, or medically. Why? Because deviating from policy threatens managerial standing. Loyalty to the institution overrides empathy toward the human being directly in front of them. Consider online behavior. Social media platforms encourage mob psychology through engagement incentives, algorithmic amplification, tribal identity reinforcement, outrage cycles, and dehumanization dynamics. People participate in harassment campaigns because collective outrage psychologically dissolves individual accountability. Each participant feels insignificant within the crowd. Responsibility evaporates through numerical diffusion. Humans become disturbingly comfortable performing cruelty once enough other humans participate simultaneously. Even consumer culture reinforces this pattern. Individuals purchase products manufactured through exploitation, environmental destruction, psychological manipulation, and labor abuse, while emotionally distancing themselves from the consequences because the supply chain obscures visibility. Modern systems are intentionally designed to separate consumption from moral perception. If people directly witnessed every stage of production attached to their conveniences, many would psychologically collapse under the contradiction. And yet, perhaps the darkest aspect of all this is not institutional cruelty itself, but the emotional normalization surrounding it. Humans adapt to almost anything. That is both their greatest strength and one of their most horrifying weaknesses. People can normalize mass loneliness, mass debt, mass surveillance, mass anxiety, mass addiction, mass ecological collapse, mass emotional exhaustion. If dysfunction persists long enough, it becomes culture. Then anyone who reacts proportionally to the dysfunction gets labeled irrational. This is why modern people often feel spiritually trapped. They sense something deeply unnatural about the structure of contemporary life. But the surrounding population continues performing normality with such confidence that individuals begin doubting their own perception. Everyone smiles, everyone posts curated happiness, everyone continues participating, everyone keeps going to work, everyone keeps paying bills, everyone keeps scrolling, everyone keeps consuming, and beneath the performance, many are quietly deteriorating psychologically while convincing themselves this condition represents adulthood. The modern human being is frequently rewarded not for thriving, but for enduring dysfunction without visibly interrupting institutional flow. That is not health. That is containment. Now, naturally, there exists another extreme. Some people awaken to institutional absurdity and immediately descend into incoherent contrarianism. They reject all expertise, all structure, all cooperation, all systems, and all forms of collective organization. Suddenly, every traffic law becomes tyranny. Every scientific consensus becomes conspiracy, and every inconvenience becomes oppression. This is not wisdom either. The goal is not becoming an antisocial chaos goblin screaming at supermarket employees because the self-checkout machine requested item verification. Civilization already contains sufficient quantities of those organisms. No, genuine psychological independence requires something much more difficult. The ability to cooperate without surrendering moral autonomy. The ability to participate without becoming spiritually absorbed. The ability to function within systems while retaining the capacity to criticize them honestly. That capacity is civilization's immune system. Without morally conscious individuals capable of principled refusal, every institution eventually drifts towards self-preservation over humanity. Bureaucracies naturally prioritize continuity. Corporations naturally prioritize profit. Governments naturally prioritize stability. Algorithms naturally prioritize engagement. None of these systems possess intrinsic morality independent of the humans operating them, which means individual conscience remains essential. The problem is that conscience is exhausting. Thinking critically requires energy. Moral courage carries risk. Social conformity feels safer. Most humans prefer predictable approval over difficult truth because exclusion historically threatened survival within tribal environments. And modern institutions exploit this ancient psychological wiring constantly. Humans fear social rejection with astonishing intensity. Many people will tolerate obvious falsehoods, manipulation, abuse, corruption, or injustice simply to avoid becoming socially isolated. They fear awkwardness more than dishonesty. They fear conflict more than cowardice. Observe any social gathering where someone says something cruel, degrading, prejudiced, manipulative, or abusive. Most people remain silent, not necessarily because they agree, but because challenging the statement risks social tension. Modern civilization worships smoothness, smooth interactions, smooth branding, smooth emotional presentation, smooth customer experiences, and smooth public relations messaging, smooth bowel movements. Anything disruptive becomes pathologized almost immediately. Anger becomes toxicity, grief becomes weakness, despair becomes negativity, dissent becomes instability. And yet many emotional reactions labeled unhealthy are entirely rational responses to genuinely unhealthy conditions. A population experiencing ecological anxiety, economic instability, social fragmentation, loneliness, algorithmic manipulation, institutional distrust, and chronic uncertainty is not malfunctioning when it feels distressed. It is perceiving reality. But systems dependent upon continuous functionality cannot easily accommodate existential honesty. So discomfort itself becomes medicalized, individualized, and psychologically privatized. You are unhappy because your brain chemistry is defective, not because your environment may actually be spiritually corrosive. Convenient narrative, isn't it? And so humans continue optimizing themselves for systems that would replace them immediately if economically advantageous. They sacrifice health for productivity, relationships for career advancement, attention for digital stimulation, and moral clarity for social acceptance. Then eventually they wonder why life feels hollow despite external functionality. Because functionality alone does not create meaning. A perfectly functioning machine can still be spiritually dead. And perhaps that is the final danger of becoming a managed organism with a tax number. You slowly lose contact with your own authentic moral and emotional experience. You stop asking, what do I truly believe? What kind of world am I helping create? What values actually matter to me? What would I refuse to participate in even if socially rewarded? Instead, you simply adapt, optimize, perform, comply, consume, repeat, until eventually your identity itself becomes indistinguishable from institutional expectation. And that, dear citizens, is how civilizations produce populations that are technologically advanced, economically productive, socially regulated, and spiritually anesthetized, which is why preserving independent thought matters so profoundly. Read difficult things, question incentives, examine authority critically. Notice propaganda patterns. Pay attention to language manipulation. Ask who benefits from your obedience. Retain the ability to say no calmly and clearly without requiring permission from consensus reality. Because once a society loses individuals capable of principled refusal, systems become capable of almost anything, including horrors performed politely by smiling professionals with retirement plans and ergonomic office chairs. And now, if you will excuse me, I must return to filing government documents before civilization dispatches armed accountants to my location like economically motivated gargoyles descending from the heavens of administrative compliance. Good night, citizens. Try not to become furniture for systems that would forget your name before your chair became cold.